Welcome back, everyone. Before we dive in, make sure you drop your thoughts and the lessons you took from this story in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Michaela always thought her story would be one of steadfast love and enduring vows. She and Terrence had a kind of chemistry that made their friends shake their heads and smile. There was a quiet magnetism between them, the kind that made their banter feel effortless, their glances full of understanding, and their laughter like a call-and-response melody. They carried themselves as if a safer, better world had been promised to them, and they were already living inside it. Their wedding in downtown Atlanta felt like a celebration too bright to fade. Elegant attire, soaring music, long tables of soul food that reminded everyone of home, and a promise that seemed almost visible in the air. People said you could see the love shining between them. For a while, Michaela believed that nothing and no one could dim their light. From their first months together, however, Michaela sensed a chill from Terrence's family. His mother, Loretta, wore her smiles like tightly drawn curtains, and his younger sister, Tanisha, seemed always to hover near her brother, offering him little whispers at the edges of conversations. When Michaela reached to help in the kitchen, Tanisha's eyes sometimes flitted away in a practiced role, as if to say, "Here she goes again." At first, Michaela tried to win them over. She brought thoughtful gifts she knew they would use, volunteered to host Sunday dinners, and studied their family traditions so she could honor them with care. She told herself that time would dissolve suspicions. But time did not soften anything. If anything, the more Michaela glowed, the more she advanced in her career, the more openly she adored Terrence, the more distant his mother and sister became. It was as if kindness made them wary and accomplishment made them defensive. Michaela was a clinical therapist with a gentle voice and an incisive mind, the first person in her family to graduate from college. She had a way of moving that turned ordinary moments into something serene, as though she could thread grace through the needle of a difficult day. She dreamed of a home full of warmth, children's laughter, and a daily ritual of choosing each other, no matter the stress, no matter the hour. Terrence's family, however, could not quite shake the feeling that she was a little too much. Too composed, too competent, too ready with answers to questions they preferred to leave unasked. Or perhaps, as Tanisha once hissed in an impatient whisper, she seemed to try too hard to be perfect. That whisper stuck in the air and found echoes in smaller slights that followed. Michaela began to catch fragments of conversations at family gatherings, little slits of speech that stung as they went by. "Are you sure you need to work so much?" Loretta would say, peering over her glasses in a way that somehow managed to be both polite and dismissive. A real wife understands her priorities. Terrence defended Michaela at first, firmly and without hesitation. But as the months passed, he grew weary of being a bridge between two shores that did not wish to meet. He acted as though there was no tension at all, as though the problem would solve itself through silence. Even so, for 2 golden years, they built a space that belonged only to them. They lived in Inman Park and decorated their home with art and photographs from their travels, snapshots from New Orleans and Savannah, and shelves overflowing with books that carried their thoughts past midnight. They hosted cookouts where music drifted out onto the porch and friends lingered until the cicadas were loud enough to replace conversation. They always returned to one shared dream: to build a family that would expand the love they had made. The real shift began when Michaela became pregnant. They had been hoping, planning, and picturing it together, holding the idea between them like light cupped in their hands. When the test turned positive, Terrence's joy was real, but it was shadowed by something Michaela could not name. Worry, perhaps, or the anticipation of pressure he felt powerless to resist. Michaela, meanwhile, felt an early, steady radiance, a hope blooming so fully in her chest that even the morning nausea could not undo it. She called her mother, her best friends, and her sister, Renee, in Houston. She even texted Loretta with the news, hoping for fresh ground on which a truce might grow. The response from Loretta was cool and clipped. "Congratulations. Hope you know what you are doing." Michaela tried to brush it away, telling herself that a new grandchild might bridge old gaps. Instead, the gap widened. In the months that followed, Terrence's work became unstable. He was a young executive at a tech startup poised for its first major investor, and everything hung on a single deal that kept slipping through his fingers. The promise of sudden momentum gave way to tension that filled their living room like static. Michaela started working longer hours as well, saving for the baby and creating space for Terrence to let his worries out without shame. She massaged his shoulders while he stared at the ceiling in the quiet, slipped notes of encouragement into his lunch, and whispered prayers for peace into the soft dark before dawn. But as the deal wavered, the weeks were measured in losses. The investor withdrew. Rumors began to float through the office like smoke. Their bank account thinned. Plans for the nursery slowed to a practical crawl. Terence became short-tempered, then withdrawn, then restless, the way a sailor scans the horizon when a storm refuses to declare itself. That was when Loretta began to visit more. She would drift into the kitchen and rearrange pots as if the cupboards had wronged her. She would lift lids, make quiet faces at the simmering food, and pronounce judgments that sounded half culinary and half moral. "There is a heaviness in this house," she would say, pressing her finger along the countertop as though testing the dust for causes. Tanisha joined her, offering little barbs disguised as observations, asking why Michaela spoke so often about feelings, as if care and attention were gimmicks and not the substance of a life you build in partnership. At first, Terence defended his wife without hesitation. But as his professional losses stacked up like unpaid bills, he began to echo his mother's anxieties. "Maybe we took on too much all at once," he would say, a weary edge in his voice. "Maybe we tried to build in a season meant for waiting." Within a single, wrenching month, the ground fell out from under him. Terence was passed over for a promotion, one he had been informally promised, one he had already begun to envision when he looked at the nursery paint swatches lined up on the table. His boss delivered the news in a voice that could have been reading from a weather report. The big deal, the one that had tethered their hopes, collapsed completely. Their savings dwindled to numbers that made careful planning feel like a kind of pleading. Bills formed a lean, unfriendly stack on the kitchen counter. Loretta's voice sharpened. Terence began coming home later, his jaw set, the smell of cheap bourbon clinging to him like a second shirt. He talked less and stared more, as though still negotiating with a future that would not return his calls. Michaela did everything she could think to do. She clipped coupons and took on additional clients, scheduling evening appointments with women who needed a witness to their pain. She cooked larger meals and packed leftovers for the next day to quiet the worry that had begun to rattle her. She kept joy in the house by humming lullabies as she folded the smallest clothes she had ever held in her hands. She reminded Terence that love would hold them steady even when money could not. But something inside him had tilted. He began to search for explanations that would let him off the hook for what life had put on his shoulders. He grew suspicious and then superstitious, tracing misfortune back to Michaela as though cause and blame were the same language. By then she was visibly pregnant, her glow undimmed by stress in the eyes of anyone who loved her. Though in the mirror she saw a woman learning how to carry heartbreak and hope in the same body. Loretta, seeing her son's despair like a crack running through glass, leaned in harder. One evening, as Michaela folded onesies in the small room that would become the nursery, she heard voices through the doorway. Loretta's whisper, low and insistent, and Terence's strained silence. "Ever since you brought that woman into your life," Loretta murmured, "nothing has gone right. She is a bad omen, son. You were fine before her. Look at what has happened since." The words slid into Michaela's chest like a cold blade. She pressed her palm to her abdomen and stood still in the half-light, breathing slowly so her daughter would feel steadiness where the world offered tremors. Everything broke fully 2 weeks later. Michaela, now 8 months pregnant, went to her appointment with her obstetrician for a routine checkup. She made light conversation with the nurse and texted Terence updates, and she slid a new sonogram picture into her purse with a private smile, already imagining the way Terence's face would soften when he saw their baby's delicate profile. When she pulled up to the house, she saw her suitcase and a duffel bag on the porch. At first, she let herself believe that Terence had planned something kind, a short trip, a chance for her to rest. As she walked closer, she saw the truth. The bags were thrown together in a clumsy rush, clothes half-folded, zippers barely closed. The front door was locked. She rang the bell, knocked, called Terence's phone, then called again. Panic gripped her throat like a hand. After a long wait, the door opened just a narrow sliver. Terence's face looked unfamiliar, as if someone had told him to play himself, and he could not remember the lines. He stared at her for a long moment. "Leave," he said, each word flat and hard. "Leave before you ruin my life for good with your bad luck." He closed the door. Michaela stood there, the sound of the lock turning louder than any shout. Before she could move, Loretta appeared behind the screen door with another bag. She pushed it onto the porch and said, "Get off our property. You think you are so perfect? You have brought nothing but curses into this house." The door slammed again. The quiet street was suddenly a stage that offered no hiding place. Michaela sank to her knees, one hand on her belly, sobbing while neighbors pretended not to see what they nevertheless witnessed. She called friends, but the calls rolled to voicemail. She called her mother, who lived too far away to cross the distance that night. She called her sister, Renee, in Houston. Even on the phone, the sound of Renee's voice felt like a steadying hand. Renee sprang into action. She arranged for a car service to take Michaela to a safe hotel, texted her every 10 minutes until the car arrived, and stayed on the line while Michaela gathered what she could and stepped into the night as carefully as someone crossing a river. The hotel room felt strange and clean and slightly unreal. Michaela lay down on the bed and placed her hand on her stomach. She shook with fear and grief until she fell asleep from the exhaustion of both. By morning, Renee had booked Michaela a bus ticket. She left work, drove to the station, and waited at the curb with a coat and a wide-armed hug that said more than words could ever manage. When Michaela stepped off the bus, swollen, tired, and blinking in the Texas sun, Renee wrapped her up and whispered, "You are safe now. I have you." Back at her house, Renee tried to persuade Michaela to file suit and protect herself in every way the law allowed. "Take everything," Renee said. "At least take what you are owed." But Michaela could not bring herself to picture a courtroom. Even then, she loved Terrence, though the love had been battered and bent, and she was afraid of bringing additional pain into her daughter's life before it had even begun. Michaela settled into the quiet of Renee's guest room and let herself be weak for a time. The first month passed like a long rain. Michaela struggled to eat. Sleep came in fits, heavy when it came, withholding when it did not. She cried at night and understood that tears could clean a wound but could not close it. She mourned the loss of the man she had chosen, the future she had built piece by careful piece, and the home where she had tucked love into the corners. Renee nursed her back by cooking meals that tasted like childhood, walking with her at a slow pace around the neighborhood, and saying ordinary encouraging things in a way that made them sound newly true. Slowly, Michaela found herself again in the steady rhythms of her sister's house. The washing machine's hum, the click of a light turning off, the tea steaming in a mug while the morning widened. Michaela's daughter, Zora, arrived on a rainy April morning, healthy and strong, her tiny fingers curling around Michaela's thumb with conviction. In that instant, the boundaries of Michaela's life rearranged themselves around a promise she made out loud. "I will give you the life and love you deserve." She meant every word. It felt like the beginning of a chapter she had never expected, but it also felt like something she had been practicing for in every kindness she had ever offered anyone. The nurses congratulated her, and Renee cried, and Michaela held her child with a gratitude that filled her bones. The path back into work began with a single practical step. Michaela found a part-time job as a receptionist at a local wellness center. The center was unassuming from the outside but warm within, with plants basking on window ledges and chairs that invited people to sit and exhale. The owner, Ms. Evelyn, noticed Michaela's calm presence and the way clients seemed to open to her even before a conversation began. She encouraged Michaela to lead a guided meditation one evening when the scheduled instructor called out. That night, in a room that smelled faintly of eucalyptus and lemon, Michaela led a group through breathing and a short visualization, and something unlocked in her that had been waiting for permission. Ms. Evelyn, with her keen eye for people's gifts, nudged Michaela forward. "Start a small support group," she said. "Begin with what you know. Use your training. Use your life." Michaela was cautious at first, but listened to the tug in her spirit. She began facilitating circles for women who were healing from breakups, betrayals, and losses. She took care to set the tone and to keep the space honest and gentle. In those sessions, she offered what she had, a steady gaze, practical tools, and permission for people to tell the truth about their lives without apology. She watched women arrive closed and leave a little less guarded. She watched pain make room for possibility. In helping them, she recognized her own strength again and began to rebuild her confidence one evening at a time. Months turned into years marked by milestones both ordinary and remarkable. Michaela balanced motherhood with study, finishing her master's degree online in the late hours after Zora was asleep, typing papers with the kind of focus that adversity can teach a person. The wellness center became her second home. She took on more responsibilities, created curricula for small group series, and began to envision a larger platform for the work that was slowly changing the shape of her days. Eventually, she launched her own brand, Queen Sanctuary, an initiative dedicated to helping Black women reclaim their power, recover their sense of self after trauma, and gather in community. She built it on clarity rather than hype, on routines that worked rather than promises that outpaced the day. Queen's Sanctuary resonated swiftly. Word spread that the workshops were not just inspiring but useful. Exercises were practical. The reflections were rigorous without being harsh. Women left with notebooks full of language for feelings that had previously sat unnamed inside them. Michaela's social media presence grew in the way organic things grow, through people telling people. Her workshops began to sell out. She learned to say no when a schedule began to outgrow its owner. She learned to ask for help before she was drowning. She learned to keep the focus on the work rather than on herself. The balance between public voice and private life was not simple, but she protected it with intention. One afternoon, after a particularly moving support group closed in a hush that felt like prayer, a local news crew arrived at the center. A reporter had heard about Michaela's work and wanted to feature her as part of a segment on resilience and community healing. Michaela hesitated. She worried that the exposure might invite old complications, that telling her story would force her to step back into a past she had worked so hard to set down. Ms. Evelyn took her hand and said, "Your story will give someone else a map. Let it be a lantern." Michaela agreed. The interview aired on a Sunday morning. Within days, her inbox filled with messages from women she had never met who felt seen by the contours of her journey and encouraged by the clarity of her voice. Meanwhile, Terrence's world had contracted into a narrow corridor of consequences. In the short term, after he put Michaela out, he basked in Loretta's approval and relied on Tanisha's presence, as if their attention could steady him where responsibility had not. But nothing he tried at work succeeded. The company tightened its belt, and Terrence was among the first to go in a round of layoffs that arrived disguised as a strategy reset. Debt collectors began calling with clockwork persistence. Colleagues he had known for years drifted away. He told himself it was temporary, that he would recalibrate and return, but weekly plans turned into monthly delays, and then into a year punctuated by disappointments and a loneliness he could not outthink. The losses grew. The house he and Michaela had imagined as a foundation for their family slid toward foreclosure, and then into it. Terrence packed boxes in silence, heaped them in the back of borrowed vehicles, and moved them into temporary spaces that never became homes. Loretta, who had pushed the hardest against Michaela, met a new man and left without looking back. She changed her number and moved to a city hours away. Terrence called and texted. She did not reply. Tanisha started a new life in Chicago, posting photos that did not include him, answering his messages after long gaps or not at all. Terrence's isolation hardened into something that resembled a sentence. One afternoon, hungry and exhausted after walking the city without aim, Terrence passed a storefront where a television played without sound. The news segment featured Michaela, calm, composed, speaking about community, healing, and the child she was raising without him. Terrence stopped in the middle of the sidewalk. Even without audio, he could read the tenor of her words in the movement of her face and the measured strength of her posture. Regret closed around him. Shame followed, and then a hollow quiet that frightened him with its finality. He turned away, but the image lodged and would not release him. He had made choices that he could not undo with excuses. That same evening, in a house several cities away, Loretta watched the same segment. Seeing Michaela celebrated for the very qualities she had mocked and resisted unsettled something deep inside her. It was not simply jealousy. It was an awareness that she had worked against a good thing and left her son stranded in the rubble she had helped to create. As the segment ended, Loretta suffered a heart attack. She was rushed to the hospital and spent months in a bed that hummed and beeped and held her to silence. She lay there bitter and alone. The daughter-in-law she had tormented did not come to visit. The man she had urged to choose pride over love did not have the means or the heart to make the trip. Consequences had edges, and she felt them press against her. Back in Houston, Michaela continued to rise with the steady pace of someone who had chosen work over spectacle. Queen's Sanctuary expanded from a local initiative into a regional and then a national movement. Invitations arrived from universities that wanted her to speak, from churches seeking to host weekends of rest and reflection, from community centers hoping to offer practical tools for healing after harm. Michaela built a small team and taught them what she knew: how to hold space, how to structure a difficult conversation so that everyone could leave intact, how to measure success by whether people felt more capable in their own lives. She protected her daughter's privacy and made home a place where being ordinary was an honored practice. Zora grew into a confident, joyful child who loved words and learned early how to name what she felt. She and her mother walked to the park in the evening and made a game of spotting the first star. Zora sat in the back of workshops sometimes, drawing in a sketchbook and looking up when her mother's voice lifted. She was proud without being possessive, curious without being indiscreet. She understood, as much as a child can, that her mother had made a hard turn and kept going. The bond between them was a daily practice, not a performance. They cooked simple meals, read on the couch, and laughed in a way that restored the day to its proper size. Michaela never remarried. She did not measure her wholeness against that ritual. It was not that she closed herself off. It was that she found contentment in a life she had rebuilt with deliberate hands. She tended to friendships carefully and learned how to be alone without feeling lonely. She traveled for work and came home quickly. She did not wait for a rescue that was never coming. Instead, she did what she had always done. She rescued herself and then set about rescuing others by showing them how to do the same. At family gatherings, her relatives marveled at her composure and her steady joy, though she did not perform either quality for them. She had earned her calm the long way. Sometimes Michaela thought about Terence. She did not nurse fantasies of reconciliation, nor did she rehearse scenes of revenge. She simply remembered that the man she had loved had become a stranger, and that it is possible to lose someone who is still alive. She learned again that family can fail you, and that you can survive anyway. She practiced forgiveness slowly and deliberately, not for him but for herself and for the child who deserved to live in a home where resentment did not hang like a curtain. The forgiveness was not naive. It did not erase what happened or pretend that accountability was unnecessary. It simply freed Michaela from carrying a weight that did not help either of them stand up straight. Terence's life did not correct course. The debts multiplied like worries left unattended. His health faltered under the strain of chronic stress and poor choices. The circle of people who would return his calls shrank until he could count them on one hand and then on one finger. With no steady work and no savings left, he spent nights on couches and then on floors and then under a bridge where the wind came through in a thin thread that never warmed. In the lead-gray hours before dawn, he would drift to sleep and dream of the house in Inman Park, the porch with the late music, the scent of dinner warming the kitchen, and the sound of Michaela laughing in the next room. He would wake with the knowledge that he had traded a real life for a story he told himself to feel right instead of responsible. He wondered every day how things might have unfolded if he had chosen differently. If he had defended his wife instead of resenting her steadiness. If he had refused to make his mother's suspicion his own. If he had walked through hardship beside Michaela instead of pushing her out into the night. Wondering did not alter the shape of his days. It simply added a sharpness to them. He considered calling her once, not to ask for anything but to apologize without expectation, to say that he knew now what he did not know then. He did not make the call. The apology lodged in his throat and stayed there, a reminder of what might have been repaired if spoken in time. Michaela did not look back. Her life was not a glow-up for the sake of appearances. It was the restoration of dignity that had been threatened but not taken, the deliberate cultivation of joy after someone had tried to starve it, and the quiet return of self-worth to its rightful place. Each day, she returned to the work of helping women name their pain and choose their next step. Each day, she showed her daughter that survival is not just what happens after the wave passes, but a skill you can learn and a strength you can build. She let herself dance in the kitchen while dinner simmered. She let herself laugh without checking the room to see who was watching. She let herself be the person she had always been when she did not have to convince anyone of her value. In the end, Michaela was the blessing Terence would never receive. His life had not been ruined by her presence. It had been enlarged by it, and then deprived when he chose pride over partnership. He lived with that knowledge in the quiet moments when the city settled and even the smallest sounds carried. Michaela, meanwhile, continued to move through her days with clarity. She did not narrate her success for applause. She did not owe anyone a tidy lesson. She had learned what she needed to learn. She knew that sometimes the greatest comeback is not loud or flashy. It is a direct, unbroken commitment to thrive in a life that someone else was too blind and too broken to cherish. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.